Russian President Vladimir Putin has ordered troops to enter two separatist regions in eastern Ukraine. He's calling it a peacekeeping mission after he recognized Donetsk and Luhansk as independent. Hours after Putin's order, an unmarked military convoy was seen on the outskirts of Donetsk. The United States has called Putin's claim of troops being used as peacekeepers nonsense and warned of dire consequences for Ukraine, Europe, and the world should Russia launch a full-fledged invasion. A growing number of world leaders have condemned Putin's recognition of separatist areas as a violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and a breach of international law. Ukraine's president says his country won't give up any territory and is calling for support.
It's a message that sent chills down many spines around the world. Vladimir Putin again, with little proof, blaming Ukraine for fighting in its east and hinting that even more may follow.
We demand that Kiev stop its military operations immediately. Otherwise, all responsibility for the potential continuation of bloodshed will be fully on their conscience.
With a few strokes of his pen, Russia's leader made a diplomatic solution to the crisis seem all but impossible and sent Europe on a dangerous path, perhaps towards a major war. The U.S. Secretary of State said in a tweet that Russia's recognition of the separatist regions would require a swift and firm response. Details on that response are still to be made public by Ukraine's allies. The country's President Volodymyr Zelensky made a renewed plea for tough sanctions on Moscow.
We expect clear and effective support from our partners. We'll now look closely to see who our true friends and partners are and who will continue to try to scare off the Russian Federation with mere words.
Ukraine says it will not give up its territories and accuses Russia of tearing up the Minsk roadmap to peace.
Our correspondent Fanny Pachar is in the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, and joins us. Fanny, what is going on in Donetsk and Luhansk right now?
That's the challenge, really, to independently verify what is happening right now at this 400-kilometer front line that separates Ukrainian forces on the one hand and the pro-Russian separatists in Luhansk and Donetsk on the other, because information is being controlled both by Russia and Ukraine, but specifically by pro-Russian separatists in Luhansk and Donetsk. You need a special permission even before this escalation had started. To evolve here during the past week as a journalist to report from there. So the information that we rely on or that we have is that what we're getting from international monitoring organizations like OSCE that said over the course of the past days there have been massive shellings. Now both parts here, Ukraine and Russia, are accusing each other to be the origin of that shelling. And as we have heard, Russia declaring that they are about to send forces to the eastern part, to the two what they call independent states now, Luhansk and Donetsk. They say this is like a peaceful mission, something that was bluntly rejected by the international community, that this is nonsense, the United States pointed out. The problem really is what is happening there right now as I'm speaking to you. This is hard to verify, and this is the danger in this situation, because a provocation, a bigger provocation that could be understood as such by both parts could happen, which, and there is this fear by the West, could unleash a much bigger escalation, even a war over Ukraine.
Okay, very difficult to get clear information, of course, out of that conflict zone right now. But we do know that Ukrainians are reacting to what's happening. Tell us more about what you've been learning from Ukrainians in the capital.
People here are surprised, basically. They didn't think that it's going to happen this soon or that it's going to happen at all, that Russia's President Vladimir Putin is going to make this declaration and create realpolitik from his perspective and declare that Luhansk and Donetsk are independent, with that also making clear that's no longer Ukraine. People are really worried as they look to the West That's where the NATO allies are, and to the east where Russia is, and they themselves being in between these two parts. What is going to happen? Is this conflict going to further escalate and actually mean a full-scale invasion by Russia, something that they've heard over and over again during the past week with various dates and various possibilities? Even though people are in general still calm, they are bracing for an escalation. They want to remain calm, but at the very same time, after what happened yesterday by Putin recognizing these two separatist self-proclaimed republics as states, now people here on the ground in Kyiv feel that more scenarios that they thought unlikely could actually be very, very likely.
Fanny, thank you much. Stay with us. Let's take a quick look at Donetsk and Luhansk, the two regions in eastern Ukraine that Russia has now declared to be independent.
Reminders of war are everywhere in Donetsk and Luhansk. The two provinces lie in eastern Ukraine on the border with Russia. Both declared independence after the revolution in 2014, which most in the region did not support. Separatists voted to join Russia and have fought Ukrainian forces for control ever since. Around 4 million people live in what's called the Donbas region. It's known for heavy industry and coal mining, and its large Russian and Russian-speaking population. In the main city Donetsk, banners read, "We are Russian." Moscow has handed out hundreds of thousands of Russian passports. But life is tough, caught in the middle. Many who can have left. Most pensioners are stuck. Others fight. Ukraine estimates there are around 35,000 separatist troops and accuses Moscow of filling out their ranks with Russian soldiers. In 2015, a ceasefire signed in Minsk helped end full-scale fighting. But the conflict has dragged on, leaving more than 14,000 people dead.
So funny. What does Ukraine expect next? Does the government believe that Russia will limit its deployment to the two separatist regions, or is it anticipating a broader escalation?
So far, Ukraine, President Zelensky always maintained that the probability of a full-scale invasion, that means even an assault here in Kiev, is highly unlikely. It's a very low probability there. But as we have seen the situation changing yesterday with Vladimir Putin's announcement that these two states are going to be declared independent, of course, there are various options and scenarios on the table here, while President Zelensky hopes that there's still room, even though that window seems to be narrowing, but that there's still room for some sort of a peaceful negotiation here. Now, as I'm speaking to you, we are hearing reports that tanks were seen, witnessed entering these separatist states, Luhansk and Donetsk. Russia made the announcement yesterday they are going to deploy forces across the border, but they also said that this is just a peacekeeping mission. Also, they accused Ukraine that they commit a genocide in the separatist regions. So you hear the wordings didn't change in terms of claims and counterclaims. And this is exactly where President Zelensky is actually hoping that the West is going to step up and step in and make sure that there's a clear signal here, really tough sanctions to prevent that there is a large escalation here, even a war that plays out in between Ukraine and Russia here on Ukrainian soil.
Fanny, thank you so much. Our correspondent, Fanny Fachar, there in Kiev. Let's cross over now to our Russia affairs analyst, Konstantin Eggert. He joins us from the Lithuanian capital, Vilnius. Konstantin, what did you make of Vladimir Putin's address to the nation in which he declared parts of eastern Ukraine to be independent?
Terry, I'm old enough to remember Leonid Brezhnev, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, making pronouncements. But no speech by any Soviet or Russian leader impressed me more than Vladimir Putin's yesterday's pronouncement. It lasted for nearly an hour, 56 minutes to be precise, and essentially was a huge lecture in the history of the Soviet Union and Ukraine, Vladimir Putin style. And in this pronouncement, he essentially denied any legitimacy to Ukrainian statehood. So essentially that means that for him, all options are on the table. And we know that Putin likes to say, after doing something, he likes to say, well, I told you so before, you just didn't read my article or you didn't listen to my speeches attentively enough. And I think this is exactly the case. I think that this is, for now, just the first stage of Vladimir Putin's big plan to either dismember or completely subjugate Ukraine.
Again, listening to Putin's address, and there's a lot that can be read into it, what do you think his intentions are in Ukraine and the region as a whole? Is he trying to restore the Russian Empire?
Well, I think it's a bit of a simplification. I don't think he wants Central Asia back. But having read his piece, his big article about Ukraine, 5,000 words or even probably more, published last summer, one cannot escape the conclusion that for him, Ukraine is a number one priority. He sees it as part of his legacy. And I think that what he announced yesterday is just the beginning. I think for now, we'll see Russian forces definitely deploying to the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. And today, the Russian Federation Council, 2 chambers of parliament, will, in all probability, vote to recognize them. But already signals from the State Duma, the lower house of parliament, indicate that recognition will happen within the borders of the 2 Luhansk and Donetsk districts. There's a very important distinction here. The so-called republics, for now, only parts of these areas of Ukraine. There are wider swathes of Donetsk and Luhansk regions which are currently under Ukrainian control. But in the so-called constitutions of these 2 entities, which were created essentially by Moscow, it says that their jurisdiction stretches all the way across the whole 2 regions of Ukraine. That means that essentially the groundwork is being laid for further pressure on Kiev. Putin will now say, well, okay, if you don't want to lose the rest, do something for me. And I think this is how the escalation will continue happening.
Very interesting to see if Russia will push beyond that ceasefire line in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. But thank you very much, Konstantin Eggert, our Russian affairs analyst and correspondent. Thank you so much. Well, let's get some reaction from Brussels now here in Europe. Our bureau chief, Alexandra von Namen, is standing by. Alexandra, how is the EU likely to react to these latest moves by Russia?
Well, the European Union reacted yesterday very quickly with a statement issued by the 2 senior figures here in Brussels, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and the European Council President Charles Michel. And they condemned Russia's recognition of the 2 breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine, saying that this is a blatant violation of international law. And they also promised that the European Union will react with firmness and with determination in solidarity with Ukraine. And what followed was a statement announcing sanctions against those involved in this illegal act. And the key questions now are, is Vladimir Putin going to be targeted by those sanctions? He is certainly directly involved. And the second question is, are we just going to see asset freezes and travel bans as usual? Or is the European Union going to impose more severe sanctions? And that is definitely something that the EU ambassadors are going to speak about and decide today.
Okay. NATO is also a player in all of this, of course, Alexandra. Russia is saying that it wants NATO to give assurances that Ukraine will never become a member. What is NATO going to do now? It's already beefed up its presence in Eastern Europe. What can it do?
Well, I think that it is certain that NATO is going to increase its presence in Eastern Europe, even beyond that what has already been announced, because its Eastern European members are very concerned about the situation. They are scared what Russia may do next. They are scared that the conflict, the crisis could spill over further into Europe. So we are definitely going to see an increased NATO presence on NATO territory. And NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg condemned Russia's actions, saying that they erode efforts towards a peaceful solution to the whole crisis. And he also accused Russia of trying to stage a pretext to invade Ukraine. So that is certainly also a topic that NATO ambassadors are going to talk about today, trying to prepare for every possible scenario there.
Alexander, thank you very much. That was Alexander von Namen, our bureau chief in Brussels. The United Nations Security Council has held an emergency session over the crisis. Russia used the session to accuse Ukraine of shelling residential areas in eastern Ukraine and said it would prevent a, quote, bloodbath. The United States envoy promised it would bring new sanctions against Russia.
Russia's clear attack on Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity is unprovoked. It is an attack on Ukraine's status as a UN member state. It violates a basic principle of international law, and it defies our charter. What is more, this move by President Putin is clearly the basis for Russia's attempt to create a pretext for a further invasion of Ukraine.
At present, all parties concerned must exercise restraint and avoid any action that may fuel tensions. We welcome and encourage every effort for a diplomatic solution.
Mr. President, my government condemns Russia's violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine in the strongest possible terms. With our allies and partners, we will take firm and adequate measures in response to Russia's breach of international law that will have serious economic, political and geostrategic consequences.
The United Kingdom will be announcing new sanctions on Russia in response to its breach of international law and attack on Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. There will be severe economic consequences.
France condemns Russia's recognition of the separatist eastern regions of Ukraine. This is not just a further attack on the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, but it is also a violation of the fundamental principles of the UN Charter.
We call for restraint on all sides. The immediate priority is de-escalation of tensions, taking into account the legitimate security interests of all countries and aimed towards securing long-term peace and stability in the region and beyond.
And with us now from Washington is our correspondent, Stefan Simons. Stefan, we just heard some of the voices from the various members of the UN Security Council. They are reacting to Russia's latest moves. But can we expect any action from the Security Council given Russia's role there?
No, I think we heard the best of it for now, at least from the UN Council. And as you just heard in those sound bites there from all the ambassadors to the UN, from the several or all the countries in the Security Council, Europeans and Americans strongly condemning Russia's action, and the Chinese, well, not so much, because they are, of course, trying to navigate deepening ties between Russia and China. So a little bit softened there, no condemnation from the Chinese. And real action in terms of the UN Security Council deciding anything which would really actually harm Russia, that's very unlikely, actually. I think this is as good as it gets from the UN Security Council, because, as you know, Russia, and that is a little bit bizarre, it chairs the council at the moment, as the presidency of the council.
Stefan, thank you very much. Was our correspondent Stefan Simons in Washington. Well, Poland shares a significant border with Ukraine, and it's preparing for the possibility of a major influx of Ukrainian refugees if the crisis escalates further. The Polish government has said up to 1 million migrants could seek shelter and is preparing facilities near the border to house them. Some Ukrainians have already started arriving in Poland.
After a 10-hour drive from Kyiv, Irina Gawryliaka is ready to unpack her suitcases at this monastery in the Polish city of Przemysl. It's just 10 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. She came here with her 2 daughters as well as her brother and sister. Irina doesn't want her children to experience the horrors of war.
I received a message from my daughter's school. It said the basement was ready with running water, food, toys, and blankets. The children could be safe there for 5 days if anything happened. That's when I realized how serious the situation is.
Irina is worried about an attack by Russian troops, so she sought shelter at the monastery. At first, they plan to stay a week, hoping that it will be possible to return home soon. The city has a school for its Ukrainian minority. If Russia does invade Ukraine, Irina will be able to register her daughters at the school. The school's principal, Piotr Pipka, and all the teachers here speak both Polish and Ukrainian. It would definitely be easy to communicate with these children. And I think it would certainly be a substitute for their homeland. Thousands of Ukrainians live in Przemysl, and over 1 million now live in Poland. Many fled to their western neighbor after war broke out in Donbass, and so far they've been welcome as mostly low-wage workers. The new wave of migrants has led to mixed reactions, especially due to their history of conflict. They killed us before. I have no love for them, but if they need help, we have to help them.
Everyone's afraid of this war because we don't know what impact it will have. It could lead to an influx of migrants to Poland and other countries. I wouldn't offer them a room, but I'd give them some food. I live alone, so I'd be afraid. I often go to the Ukrainian dentist because his prices are good and I've never been disappointed. But I can't say today whether I'll help them.
Irina Gawryliaka hopes there won't be war or a wave of refugees. She views her own trip to Poland as a type of life insurance.
We buy health insurance or car insurance and hope we don't need it. Coming here is like insurance for our children. But we really hope that we don't need this insurance.
But now Irina intends to stay in Poland until she is certain that it's safe to return home.
I'm joined now by Polish-German political scientist Dr. Weronika Prismaier-Tekocz. She's Deputy Director of the European Academy in Berlin. Thanks very much for being with us. Now, Ukraine shares borders with several EU member states. What are the implications of this crisis, not just for Poland, but for Central and Eastern Europe as a whole?
Okay. Welcome. Well, of course, we can think that there is going to be a refugee wave, but what we've discussed already, or what we've seen 10 years ago, was that the majority of refugees stay in Ukraine and only some of them go to Europe. Now, it's of course the situation is different. There is a visa-free regime with Ukraine, so there might be, of course, more people coming to Europe, not only to Poland, not only to neighboring countries, but to the others. The society, I think, is prepared. The government's not yet. So it means it's it's time for you, not only for the countries, but also for the whole EU, to tackle upon right measures to welcome the refugees and, of course, welcome the people from Ukraine.
Now, several Central and Eastern European countries have expressed displeasure with the way that that Western European countries have responded to this crisis. Is this crisis bringing Eastern Europe and Western Europe, just to put it in broad terms, closer together, or is it making the fault lines even deeper?
Well, of course, the Eastern European countries who are more connected via history and religion and culture with Ukraine, they have a stronger view on the question, how should we tackle up on the relations with Russia? But I think now this is really a time to stand together in the European Union, but also in the NATO, and work not only around the conflict, but really in NATO, to have a joint answer on the conflict. But it's also really a time for countries such as Hungary to think on what side they actually are and to really stand together with the European community in order to really prepare the right answer to illegal measures that are being done in the East.
Dr. Priesmeier-Touch, thank you very much for talking with us. Thanks a lot. Joining us now from Berlin is our chief international editor, Richard Walker. Richard, the UN Security Council has already reacted to Russia's latest moves on Ukraine. What's the judgment there?
Yeah, Terry, well, as you would expect, it's a divided judgment. This was a nighttime meeting of the UN Security Council that was held in public. The Russian side had wanted this to be a closed session, but it was the US side insisting that it be public. And that, of course, made it into a stage for trading of accusations between the US and its allies and the Russians on the other side, with the Chinese and the Indians broadly trying to stay on the fence between them. On the American side, Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield rubbished this notion that Russia is currently sending peacekeepers into this region, saying that was simply nonsense. The Russian ambassador, for his part, saying that Russia remains committed to diplomacy, denying the suggestion that the Minsk agreements, so these agreements that were signed 8 years ago 7 years ago, in fact, to try to resolve this conflict, that these are not dead, that Russia remains committed to try to pursue that. But that is certainly viewed as pretty much nonsense in the West. This is being seen as a clear breach of those Minsk agreements. So an angry session of the UN Security Council, but I think this is going to be the first of a great many to come.
Okay, for the administration of U.S. President Joe Biden, of course, putting Russian boots on the ground in Ukraine was a red line, as it is for many others as well. But the U.S. has been very outspoken about that. We seem to have Russian troops crossing into eastern Ukraine now. They're saying they're peacekeepers. What does this mean for the U.S. position? What can we expect from Washington?
Well, we've had a first clear response in terms of sanctions, which were imposed immediately yesterday by the US side. But these were quite focused on these regions in the east of Ukraine, these separatist regions, saying that American citizens, American companies are forbidden from doing business in any way with those regions, and also sanctions to target people from the Russian side who are involved in what's going on there. That's relatively focused on that region. In terms of whether the US is ready to go further, well, members of the administration were briefing the media yesterday saying that they will consider further steps and that they'll be watching what the Russian side are doing. There'll be some disappointment, I think, probably in Ukraine if it does just remain at this point. And I think the US and the West more broadly has a bit of a dilemma at this stage, is how big to go in terms of the sanctions on a step like this. They don't want to be seen as simply sort of rolling over and going too small in terms of sanctions. But of course, they want to retain a significant deterrent package of sanctions to try to deter Vladimir Putin from going further. So it's a finely balanced decision, I think, for the Western countries looking at this. Obviously, they've had a lot of time, a lot of consultation leading up to this moment. So they've certainly thought about it. But it's going to be very interesting to watch how they judge these packages of sanctions, not just the US, but the EU side, as we're hearing from Alexandra, as we go forward in this crisis.
Richard, thank you very much. Our chief international editor, Richard Walker, there.